the cold water always found the same crack in my right glove. A thin gap near the thumb that had been there since October and would probably be there until spring, when I could afford a new pair. I'd learned to just accept it. The numbness came fast once the water hit, and after a while you stopped noticing. That was the thing about working at Birch and Bloom. You got used to things. The ache in your lower back from bending over buckets. The way the cooler hummed at a pitch that lodged itself behind your right eye after 6 hours. The sweet, slightly rotting smell that clung to your hair on the bus ride home. That particular combination of fresh stems and yesterday's trimmings that you'd never be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't spent their days elbow-deep in flowers. I'd been at Birch and Bloom for almost 2 years. Marlene had hired me on a Tuesday in January when I showed up with a grocery bag full of half-dead carnations I'd salvaged from a gas station clearance bin and asked if she needed help. She'd looked at the flowers, looked at me and said, "You can start Thursday." I'd hugged those carnations the whole bus ride home. The shop was in the Allegheny West neighborhood of Pittsburgh. A 3-block stretch of family-owned businesses that had somehow survived everything the city had thrown at them for 40 years. Marlene had run Birch and Bloom for 18 of those years. Harold Kinsey, who came in every Wednesday for a single stem of whatever was newest, had been shopping here for 30. The bakery next door was owned by a couple named the O'Cases, who'd been married 43 years and argued about croissants, the way other couples argued about money. We were the kind of block that people described as charming when they meant clinging to existence. The rumors had started in September. A development company had purchased 2 properties at the end of the block, then 3 more in October. By November, the word redevelopment was appearing in neighborhood association emails with the anxious frequency of a word nobody wanted to be the first to say out loud. Marlene had been quiet about it, which was its own kind of answer. Marlene was never quiet about anything. I was trimming the last of a Tuesday morning delivery. Deep burgundy dahlias that had survived the November cold better than they had any right to. When the door opened and let in a gust of freezing Pittsburgh air and the kind of man who didn't belong in a flower shop on a Tuesday morning. I noticed his shoes first. That's the thing about working retail. Develop an unconscious habit of sorting people by shoes. His were dark leather, the kind that fit perfectly because they'd been made to, not the kind you found discounted anywhere. His coat was charcoal wool, unbuttoned despite the cold, and he moved through the entrance with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms adjusting around him rather than the other way around. He wasn't looking at the flowers. He was looking at his phone, frowning at something, while a woman behind him, dark, updo, cream blazer, the composure of someone paid to have composure, spoke quietly near his ear. There was a third person behind her, a man in a dark suit scanning the shop the way people scan rooms when their job is to notice exits. "I can help you find something," I said, because that was my job, and also because nobody was going to find anything while staring at a phone. He looked up. I've tried to describe what happened in the next 2 seconds to people since then, and I always get it wrong. His eyes were dark, brown, almost black, and they moved the way expensive cameras moved, taking everything in at once and then seemed reasonable. He clocked me, the shop, the buckets behind me, the dahlias in my hand. All of it in about 2 seconds flat. "Arrangements for a corporate event," the woman behind him said, stepping forward in that slightly imperious way that suggested she handled things like this regularly so he didn't have to. "Something formal. 40 tables. Friday." I set the dahlias down and stripped off my wet glove, which was probably the least impressive thing I could have done in that moment. "We can do that. Do you have a color palette in mind, or would you like suggestions based on what's available this week?" The man, he still hadn't introduced himself, had stopped looking at his phone. He was watching me now with an attention that felt oddly specific for someone who'd come in to order corporate centerpieces. "Whatever is appropriate for a building opening," the woman said. "White and green reeds clean and modern," I said. "Ivory ranunculus, white stock eucalyptus. Or if you want something that photographs better, we could do cream and blush, add some garden roses." I was reaching behind me to pull a sample from the display bucket when my elbow caught the lip of the worktop. The bucket tipped. I grabbed it, got one hand on it, but the water had already gone, a clean arc of cold flower water that hit the man in the charcoal coat directly across the front of his shirt. The shop went very quiet. I stood there holding an empty bucket with water still dripping off the worktop, and I watched a man who almost certainly billed more per hour than I made in a month, standing in my flower shop with a soaked shirt, and the only coherent thought I could form was, I am absolutely going to lose this job. And then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Maybe it was the look on his face. Not angry, just genuinely startled, like a man who couldn't remember the last time something actually caught him off guard. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the whole situation, the expensive coat and the $8 an hour florist, and the bucket of dahlia water lying between us on the linoleum. Whatever it was, I laughed. Not a polite, horrified little sound. A real laugh, the kind that comes out before you have any say in the matter. I am so sorry, I said immediately, already reaching under the counter for the hand towels we kept there. I am genuinely, deeply sorry. That was entirely my fault. I was pressing a towel toward him before I'd consciously decided to move, and when I looked up, I found him looking at me with an expression I couldn't place. He wasn't angry. He wasn't performing not angry. He was just looking. It's all right, he said. His voice was quiet, unhurried. It's just water. The woman in the cream blazer was already on her phone. The man in the dark suit hadn't moved. And the man with the wet shirt was still watching me with that unreadable expression. Something working behind his eyes that I couldn't name. His name, I found out later from Marlene, who found everything out always, was Julian Mace, 41, founder and CEO of Mace Capital Group, a private equity and development firm with offices in Pittsburgh, New York and Chicago. He had purchased the 2 anchor buildings at the end of our block, along with 4 other properties in the neighborhood. And his firm was the redevelopment project that had been quietly panicking our street since September. He ordered the flowers, white and eucalyptus, 40 tables, delivered by Friday. He paid a deposit that was more than we usually charged for the full order, and he left without saying anything else to me. Which was fine. It was a transaction. I was the employee who drenched him with flower water and laughed about it. That was the beginning and the end of it. Except it wasn't. 3 days later, Marlene sat me down in the back room where she kept the books, between the silk ferns she'd had since 2007 and the corkboard buried in supplier invoices, and told me that Mace Capital had offered to buy out Birch and Bloom. When? I asked. The offer came in this morning. She set a paper cup of gas station coffee in front of me, her version of preparation. Fair market value plus 18 months of operating costs as a transition payment. It's more than I expected, Della. So you're selling. She was quiet for a moment in a way that Marlene almost never was. She looked at her hands, the hands of someone who'd spent decades working with them. My sister's been asking me to come out to Tucson, help her with the inn out there. A small, tired smile. I keep telling her I'll think about it. I didn't say anything, because there was nothing I could say that didn't amount to asking her to stay for my sake alone, and that wasn't fair to anyone. There's something else, she said. The something else was a phone call she'd received along with the offer. Julian Mace wanted to speak with me. He came back to the shop on a Thursday evening after we'd closed. No assistant this time, no bodyguard. Just him in a dark wool sweater that made him look like a different person, more ordinary, which was entirely the wrong word for someone like Julian Mace, but the closest I had. He sat on the 3-legged stool we kept near the worktop because we were always slightly short on chairs. And he looked around the shop the way you look at places you're about to take apart. You laughed, he said. I'd been expecting a job offer, a contract, some kind of formal business conversation. I did, I said. I apologize for that part too. Don't. He picked up a dahlia stem from the scrap pile, turning it over in his hands. His fingers were wrong for a man in his position. The knuckles slightly thickened, the skin at the base of his palms rougher than his tailored appearance suggested, like hands that remembered a different life. Every other person in that room was calculating what the situation meant for them. You just laughed. Like it was funny. Because it was. I didn't know what to do with that. I'm building a public market as part of the redevelopment, he said. Ground floor of the north building. Local vendors, a community hall, a small cafe. Not the kind of place that charges $14 for toast. His mouth did something almost like a smile. I want someone who understands what makes a neighborhood worth preserving to help design it, to run it. He looked at me with that same direct, unhurried focus. I want you. The position he described was everything the word job had never meant to me. A real salary, benefits, the chance to build something that might actually matter. I told him I needed time to think. He said he understood. I went home to my apartment, 11 minutes from the shop, a radiator that worked only when it felt like it, a bathroom window that never quite closed, and I sat on my bed with my coat still on and thought about what it meant to take a job from the man who was closing the place that had given me purpose for 2 years. I called Marlene at 9 o'clock at night, which she would normally not tolerate. "Take it," she said before I'd finished explaining. "Marlene." "Della." Her voice was firm but kind. "I've been deciding whether to sell that shop for 5 years. This isn't something Julian Mace did to me. It's a direction I've been moving toward and couldn't admit." A pause. "The neighborhood changes whether you fight it or welcome it. You can be buried by that, or you can be part of shaping what it becomes. That's the real choice." I accepted the position the following Monday. What came after was the strangest 3 months of my life. I spent mornings in orientation sessions at Mace Capital's downtown office, learning things like vendor procurement and lease negotiation and public space programming, none of which I'd ever thought about before. And evenings at the market construction site getting walked through architectural drawings by a project manager named Walt, who had the patience of someone who'd explained things to a lot of people who didn't know things. Julian appeared at those site visits more often than I'd expected, and it was there, in the dusty skeletal shell of what would become the Allegheny Common, that I started to understand who he actually was. He remembered every detail. The ceiling height that would let vendors stack their display cases. The window placement that would give the most natural light to the southeast corner. He'd read 3 books about community market design that he mentioned with the offhand embarrassment of someone who doesn't want to appear to care too much. He asked me what I thought, and when I told him, he listened in a specific way. Not performing attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually processing what I said before he responded. I fell for him slowly, and then, all at once, the way those things work when you're not paying attention. Our first dinner was supposed to be a vendor coordination meeting. By the time the vendor left, it had become a conversation that stretched 2 more hours over coffee that went cold, and neither of us noticed. He told me about growing up in Monessen, a mill town 30 miles south of Pittsburgh, where his father had worked 3 jobs and the mills had closed anyway, and the particular desperation that comes from watching an entire community lose its reason to exist. He'd built his money the way people from those towns built everything, with no margin for failure and a terror of going back. "I've made choices I'm not proud of," he said, one night at a restaurant that was too nice for how comfortable we'd gotten with each other. He said it the way people say things they've been carrying a long time. In the early years, when the firm was just getting started, there were deals that benefited us at the expense of people who couldn't afford to lose what they lost. I watched his face. "Tell me." He did. A development deal from his first year of operating, where he'd knowingly used an appraisal process that undervalued a neighborhood's properties, so he could buy them for a fraction of what they were worth to the families living there. People who'd been in their homes for decades offered settlements that sounded reasonable until you realized they couldn't replace what they'd had. He'd known. He'd told himself it was business. "I've spent years trying to do things differently," he said. "The market, projects like it in other cities, fair buyouts, community input in design, it doesn't undo what I did, but it's the only direction I know how to move in." I thought about Marlene, about Harold Kinsey and his single Wednesday stem, about the Okaz couple and their 43 years of croissants. "You gave everyone on our block a fair offer?" I asked quietly. "More than fair." He held my gaze. "I know that doesn't fix everything." "No," I said, "but it's something." The market opened in April. We'd named it the Allegheny Common, and from the very first Saturday it felt exactly like what we'd built it to be. Loud, warm, overcrowded in the best way, smelling of roasted coffee and fresh bread, and in the southeast corner, flowers. I'd hired a florist named Peg, who reminded me of a younger Marlene. And she'd covered her stall in cream ranunculus, that first week, that made me stop in the middle of the floor and just breathe for a second. Julian stood off to the side with a paper cup of coffee and watched me work. When I caught his eye across the room, he raised the cup in a small, quiet salute, and it was such an understated thing that it knocked something loose in my chest, and I thought, I love him. Just like that, clearly and completely, the first time I'd let myself think the word. The happiness lasted 4 months. Then Gordon Clavell walked back into Julian's life. I didn't know the name at first. I came into the market on a Wednesday morning, before the vendors arrived, and found Julian already there, on his phone near the windows, his back to me. The tension in his shoulders was visible from across the room. When he hung up and turned and saw me, his face was controlled in a way that meant something had broken underneath the control. Gordon Clavell, Julian told me, had been his business partner in the early years of Mace Capital. They'd had a falling out when Julian pushed to change the firm's model, and Clavell refused. Clavell had left with a settlement, and with documentation of every deal they'd done together, including the Morningside appraisal manipulation. Now he wanted money. If Julian didn't pay, he was taking everything to the financial press. He mentioned you, Julian said. His voice was flat, by name. He said your proximity to me makes you useful. The word useful landed somewhere cold. He's been watching us, I said. Yes. And, if you pay him. He still has the documents. Julian rubbed the back of his neck. He comes back next year, and the year after that. I already knew what I was going to say. I'd known somehow, the moment I walked in and read those shoulders. So what's the other option? He looked at me for a long moment. The other option was a regulatory attorney and a conversation with the SEC. Voluntary disclosure of Morningside. Full cooperation with whatever investigation followed. A settlement that would cost him, there was no polite way to say it, a significant portion of everything he'd spent 20 years building. Everything I've made, he said. Not everything. I crossed the room and took his hand, which was the first time I'd ever reached for him first. His knuckles were rough under my fingers. The market is real. The people who work here are real. Clavell can't touch any of that. You can rebuild from something honest, Julian. You cannot build anything lasting on a foundation you're paying someone to keep quiet. He was quiet for a long time. You'd stay, he asked, after all of it comes out? I thought about what Marlene had said to me, 9 months ago, between a silk fern and a corkboard full of invoices. You can be buried by it, or you can help shape what it becomes. I'll stay, I said, but you have to choose this because it's right, not because of me. He looked at our hands, then back at my face. I know, he said, that's what makes it hard. The disclosure process took 6 weeks. A regulatory attorney, 2 rounds of document review, a meeting with SEC investigators who were more exhausted than intimidating, and a public statement from Mace Capital that was the most honest thing Julian had ever put his name to. Gordon Clavell, stripped of his leverage, filed a civil suit that his own attorney eventually advised him to drop. He did, 4 months later, without fanfare. The settlement cost Julian 40% of his net worth and his license to operate in 3 states. The firm restructured. 12 people lost their jobs. Julian handled each severance package personally, more generously than he was required to. The financial press covered the story for about 2 weeks, breathlessly at first, and then with declining interest, because it turned out there was no satisfying villain in a story where the principal had simply chosen to tell the truth. I visited him twice during the worst of the regulatory process, when he was working 18-hour days and eating meals he couldn't taste and looked like someone carrying the full weight of his 20s. The second time, I brought flowers from Peg's stall, ranunculus, cream and blush, a full armful. He laughed when he saw them. A real laugh, surprised, the same way I'd laughed the day I'd spilled a bucket of dahlia water on a man I didn't know would become the person I loved most. You're going to be okay, I told him. You keep saying that. Because I keep believing it. The Allegheny Common survived the restructuring. It turned a profit in its 7th month and had operating contracts independent of Mace Capital's main business. Julian had structured it that way deliberately, from the very beginning, which I didn't fully understand until later, and then understood completely. Harold Kinsey never stopped coming in on Wednesdays. He started buying his single stem from Peg, instead of from me, and told me with great seriousness that she had a better eye for what was freshest. I chose to find that encouraging. Marlene came back to Pittsburgh for a weekend in the fall, passing through on her way to Tucson. We sat in the market on a Saturday morning with paper cups of coffee, watching the vendors set up, and she looked around at the exposed brick, and the long light through the high windows, and the cluster of people gathering near the bread stall before it had even opened. "You built this," she said. "We did," I said. "Julian and I and Walt, and Peg, and Harold, actually, who told Peg her dahlias were better than mine, which I'm still not over, but," I stopped. "A lot of people." Marlene smiled into her coffee. "That's how the good ones work." Julian came through the door at 9:15, later than I'd expected, and when he saw me and Marlene sitting together, he stopped in the entrance and smiled. That rare, unhurried smile that still caught me unprepared every time, even now. He got coffee from the cart near the door, and came to sit with us. And the three of us stayed there for an hour, while the market filled up around us, and nobody was performing anything for anybody. And the coffee was ordinary. And the flowers in Peg's corner were extraordinary. And outside the November light was doing the thing it does over Pittsburgh, where it turns the whole river silver. I looked at him across the table. He was watching the room with the expression I knew by now. Genuine attention, genuine pleasure, the specific satisfaction of a person watching something exist that they helped make real. He caught me looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," I said. He knew it wasn't nothing. He reached across and covered my hand with his. Those rough knuckles. That grip that was always stronger than you expected. And he didn't say anything either, which was the thing I'd learned to love most about him. He knew that some moments were worth more than words. Outside, Pittsburgh kept moving. Inside, the market filled up with people who needed somewhere to be, and we had built them somewhere worth being. And a year ago, I was a girl with a cracked glove and cold water working her way through a Tuesday, and I had smiled at a stranger for no particular reason, and it had led here, to this table, this man, this room full of ordinary life made carefully, on purpose, from something honest. That turned out to be enough. It turned out to be everything.